Hey there, Jim Johnston for Accent Help here. And I've got a short break in some tech rehearsals, so I thought I'd run some info by you about the history of Southern accents, especially focused on that soft R, non-rhotic Southern accent where the R's would get dropped. And it's something that doesn't exist, certainly to the degree that it used to. So this is something that I'm always elusively chasing, is white examples of this accent. The reason that it's hard to find is that it's really changed, and it's helpful to understand the changes about it by understanding a bit about the actual history of it, like the formation of this accent. So in order to do that, we actually have to go back and sort of hit history in other places of accents. So in England, for example, most of England used to be what's called rhotic, where the R's were said after vowels. So it'd be here, there, start, those kinds of things. So if you think about like Hagrid in Harry Potter, here, there, start, that tendency to have those R's, well, actually, in the rural country outside of London, that was actually primary all the way up to about the 1950s or so, as England as a whole was shifting more and more towards non-rhotic, dropping the R's. And that classic sort of RP sound, that didn't really exist until more like the 1700s. And even then it was existing more like in London and the southeast of England. And so where people came from that came to America and where their primary trade partners were, who they interacted with and such, all of that was heavily influenced by whatever the accents were of those people. So when you go back in time, the lowlands of the South, so the flatlands, which tended to be used for things like cotton plantations and tobacco farming and things like that, those flatlands were much more expensive, much more desirable because the land was very good. And actually, both cotton and tobacco are pretty destructive to the land. And so, especially in the way that they were farmed previously. And so it actually required a lot of land because you would basically use up the usefulness of that land and have to move to other areas. So it required people with a lot of money. And those were the people who bought people. And that's slavery in America, is the fact that in these lowlands, in these flat lands, that's where the money was, that's where the good land was, and where they needed a great deal of land for their crops. And so that's what supported the existence of slavery for so long in the US. Well, the primary people for that, the money, the people they were interacting with, were more that non-rhotic England sound, that south and southeast of England. And so that had a huge influence on those southern accents, where those R's would get dropped more in the south. And that's also where black people who were enslaved, that's where they lived. And so they were primarily interacting with these people who were dropping their R's. The white people who would drop their R's were the big influence as people from various places in Africa were enslaved and brought over. And when they were learning English, they were learning this non-rhotic English. Well, the people who were the rhotic speakers who had the R's, they were primarily more like Irish and Scottish, and they were in general, they didn't have as much money and they were less desirable people. And so they would go to the less desirable land. It was the land that they could afford. In fact, some of it they could just claim. And that was primarily in the mountains. So that's why, like the Appalachian Mountains, that's the origins of that hard R Southern that has been around for generations. Now, what's happened over time with exposure to media, with shifts in people not necessarily living in the same place their entire lives, but moving around more, so exposure. And this I don't know for certain, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it was a bit of racism also, of whites trying to stop sounding more like black people, that may be part of why R's were coming on more and more for many of these Southerners who were in these more traditionally non-rhotic areas of the South. So what's going on is that these days, when I do find a non-rhotic Southern white speaker, that speaker is primarily like 80 and older, and they're also only partially non-rhotic. So through linguistical studies in general, more open vowels are the ones where the R's tend to get dropped more. So you might hear something like stot, where the R gets dropped more, whereas that same person who's this partially rhotic, non-rhotic speaker might say near and put their R on that word a little bit more likely. So you get some variation. And that's mostly what I find these days for white speakers in the South, is that it's a mixture of rhotic, non-rhotic, dropping the R, not always dropping the R, sort of like this branch is dropping on my shoulder right now. So that history of it has influenced that accent, and that's part of why it's nigh on impossible to find fully non-rhotic white speakers from the South anymore, from most of the South. You can get it in certain places, like New Orleans still has a decent amount of non-rhotic speakers who are white, whereas that non-rhotic element has remained largely for African American speakers, and it was actually carried up to the north in the various great migrations that took place more in the first half of the 20th century. That's why oftentimes black speakers, say like in Chicago, black speakers in Chicago will oftentimes sound more like another black speaker who lives 1,000 miles away than they necessarily sound like a white speaker who lives about a mile away, because of segregation, right? That the redlining, all these different forms of racism that still exist to this day. And that difference, that Southern quality, has tended to hold on for generations, even in the North. It is affected. I was just recently working on a project. It has affected African American accents in the North. Once again, they're more likely to put R's on after vowels that are in words like near, and more likely to drop them when they're saying something like start. So along that line. So that's a bit of why the Southern accent has changed over time. And the way that I deal with them on Accent Help is what I call soft R Southern versus hard R Southern. The challenge is that there are some R's commonly in that soft R Southern, but the very classic sound of it, you would typically hear all of those R's getting dropped. But over time, it's shifting, becoming more and more rhotic, so more and more of those R's are coming on. If you want to dive into these hard R or soft R Southern accents or African American vernacular, you can find all of these materials on accenthelp.com. I've got over 50 different accents, materials for actors learning those accents available on there, that include my ever-expanding collection of native speakers. So if you are a non-rhotic Southern white speaker, those are the kinds of recordings that are really hard for me to find. So the odds are that you may not even be watching a video, but it may be like your grandparents that you're thinking of who might actually match this accent, that would be great to have a recording of. There you go. For more info, check out accenthelp.com.